Pete Hegseth's first months in charge of the world's most powerful military has been described variously as chaotic and shambolic. US Secretary of Defense has been fending off questions over his missteps, like the signal group chats and suggestions of a purge inside the Pentagon. But Mr. Hegseth insists he's getting on with the job. He describes it as ensuring the lethality of the US military and weed out what he calls woke ideology, which is what our guest today has been looking into. Professor Bethan Greener is an international security specialist and a head of school at Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Beth, welcome.
Kia ora.
Beyond these various scandals that have been swirling around Pete Hegseth, his signature policy seems to be the war on woke, for a better description. How has he been going about that?
It's been an extraordinary few months, from particularly, with the lead-in March, we saw a range of requests or requirements coming out from Hegseth's office. And, it began, I kind of characterized March as being removing various things. So, the abolishment of certain words, that you can't use terminology. Sure, we can see the may not agree with, but we can see the rationale around words like gender or diversity, perhaps, but also removing words like tolerance and most notably respect, which is effectively supposed to be one of the US Army's 7 core values. So it's the reach of this has been quite astounding. Also, the erasure of the experiences and sacrifices made by women and minorities in terms of the purposeful removal of photographs, video, evidence of their service. So the various ways in which people have effectively been erased from history, and we know that's a really problematic thing in societies, and also removing commemorative events, so Black History Month or International Women's Day, those sorts of things being seen as extraneous to the purpose of the military. Even things like recruiting, so not going out and recruiting in sites such as in girls' schools, where there had been previously a targeted effort to look at increasing participation of women in the various armed forces and branches of the armed forces. And finally, obviously, the last part of removal in March was the literal removal of personnel from their positions that they had earned. So the first Navy female chief, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, simply apparently because of their personal attributes, which is extraordinary. That was March. So do you want me to go into April, Willie, or do we need to pause?
Wonderful. The big programs that he scrapped, that he seems most proud of, is this Women, Peace and Security program. It's the WPS you've been talking about. This was something Donald Trump signed off in his first term. What exactly is this program?
Oh, dear. Yes. The irony of there having been this amazing photo opportunity for Ivanka Trump bringing this in the first Trump administration, and now this proud counselling is astonishing. So the WPS agenda, it's actually a really broad agenda that was brought about in 2000, largely from the efforts of civil society. And what civil society groups were wanting to do was to draw attention to the gendered impacts of war, conflict, and post-conflict situations, where there were particular needs that weren't being considered in operations in particular. So we know that women, men, boys, and girls, to use the terminology that's in those resolutions, experience war and the aftermath of war in different ways, and yet we hadn't kind of acknowledged that. So the first resolution in UN 1325, just to articulate that more clearly, very much drew attention to that particular issue. It was quite astounding because the UN Security Council is normally about enacting sanctions on Saddam Hussein or things like that. So it was a huge victory in terms of acknowledging that peace and security, which is the UN Security Council's main gig, is broader than just those big high politics issues of interstate war. So there are 10 resolutions around this women, peace and security agenda. They are largely split into two categories, one of which draws attention to conflict-related sexual violence. And so it was part of a significant campaign to get war rape acknowledged as a war crime, because it's a phenomenon that's been purposefully perpetrated in order to diminish, demean, and demoralize civilians and combatants in war. So a focus, that's one of the key foci of Women, Peace and Security, is drawing attention to that and seeking ways to try and prevent that, to protect particularly vulnerable populations in war. But there's also acknowledgement that, we're talking often about women because it's a women, peace and security agenda, that they're not just victims, but they're also agents. And the WPS agenda seeks ways to empower women. And at the base of it all is an acknowledgement and recognition that gender equality is in fact the number one indicator of peace. It's also a significant indicator of prosperity. So if we have a UN that's interested in peace and security, then we've got to be interested in gender. So the WPS agenda does that. In terms of how it works for the military, so as I said, it was a civil society. It was these kind of NGO groups and women's groups trying to draw attention to this issue. But often in the national action plans, which are what countries enacted from 2004 onwards, often the focus tends to be on increasing participation of women in either political roles or in policing and military institutions. And that's to see effectively to, again, empower women to be in positions of authority and that have been particularly male dominated, and also to bring those perspectives into those organizations, because of course they need to reflect the societies that they're serving. And so the WPS agenda is broad in that sense. But when it comes to military interaction, there is an aspect of encouraging women's participation in the military, yes, and looking to find ways to empower women who are in the military. But in the United States, it's not necessarily been seen as a DEI initiative. It's seen as an operational effectiveness tool. So one of the things that the WPS agenda does is it simply draws attention to the fact that people in societies play different gendered roles, and that is really important to know when it comes to combat or conflict, because you can then acknowledge that you may oversee women as combatants. You can then acknowledge that you might overlook men as victims of sexual violence, that there might be different societal drivers behind certain parts of conflict or peace. So it effectively trains people to have what they call a gender perspective, which is when it increases situational awareness, if you want to use military terminology. So your intelligence gathering changes, your capacity to act in certain community changes. We saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a lot of emphasis on searching women, and that only women could search women. So if they're not in the field, they can't do that. So there's a huge array of things packed in and around this. So I think there are two aspects: the operational effectiveness side, which WPS definitely increases operational effectiveness. And we've seen a number of US military commanders anonymously online commenting that they're not happy with this because it is something which takes away. It's also a way of empowering women, increasing women's participation, but that's not at the expense of men. There's actually a recruitment issue. So you're missing out on more than 50% of your population if you're looking for a warfighting force. You're also missing out on a kind of agenda that also allows states to communicate with each other on a variety of things, from combat all the way down to issues around participation. So it's seen as a really useful tool to engage in defense diplomacy, for example.
It's been striking how the UN has been critical of the US stepping away from the WPS. If we look to other nations' militaries in particular, how is their record at engaging with WPS?
Much better, to be frank. There was this concerted effort in the US over the last few years to actually pick up and run with this WPS agenda. There was a really effective team. I believe I know that there's a really effective team operating out of Honolulu. But it's just so ironic because it appears that every other country is doubling down on WPS and increasing support for these particular kinds of initiatives. So we see in New Zealand, we're continuing on. In Australia, they're continuing on. In Canada, they continue on. Japan is increasingly oriented itself towards WPS in terms of the support networks, in terms of funding some of the initiatives, and in terms of leading out in the region. ASEAN, it's central in ASEAN at the moment. These are supposed to be US allies or friends who still see the value and the worth in this. Now, having said that, of course, we've seen some voices, some political voices, including in New Zealand in the form of Winston Peters most recently, and Peter Dutton in Australia, effectively picking up on that woke language. But we've seen the Australian election and the Canadian election, I think, demonstrates that people can see where and when this may or may not, kind of stick for them as a society. So I think we're still seeing countries recognizing the value of this. And again, underpinning all of this is, and it can get lost, is the value of gender equality as that key indicator of peace and prosperity, and that this is a vehicle for helping us to get at that. And by gender equality, it's not just, it is about women and pay gaps and things like that, but it's also acknowledging that men can struggle with their particular assigned gender roles, mental health issues we've seen, the way in which we think of who is a protector or a provider and the demands that places, the ability to take family leave, those sorts of things. So it can get a little bit caught up in that space, and it does begin with women, but it's also very important to acknowledge that it's supposed to be good for all, effectively.
For Pete Hegseth, his stated aim in scrapping WPS and the other actions he's taking is to bring back this warrior ethos, he calls it, and a culture shift. Will these actions actually help fight wars?
No, they're going to undermine militaries from the inside. They're going to make them more fractured, as we see different ideological concepts being, jostling up against each other internally. But also, we just recent, reporting out of Ukraine, we're seeing women, mothers who have not, kind of been pulled into the military because of necessity, being very effective warfighters. We know throughout history the examples of people being effective warfighters, no matter what their background. So there is an assumption here around who should be a warfighter, who belongs, what combat looks like even. And I think that's really ironic. Hegseth, to my mind, is looking back to World War I, World War II, and thinking that the conventional war and this way of fighting will be the future of war. And I think he's very mistaken. When we look at the ways in which grey war, hybrid war, below the conventional threshold of war activities are ongoing, when we look at things like the development of drones and the speed of AI and automated weapons, when we look at things like exoskeletons, so that we don't have an issue with regards to strength when there is a need for strength, he's missing a beat, because effectively he is managing to isolate a vast proportion of the population and empower a smaller proportion of the population for whom actually this may not be good for them either, in terms of the broader cohesion or capacity of a warfighting force. But we've also seen when, really, I hate to use the word toxic masculinity, but when really difficult value sets around what's important and how you conduct yourself in war, we've seen that collapse into terrible behaviour in terms of, the Brereton report clearly has a connection between the type of culture that was being inculcated around this hypermasculinity and lethality, and then the incapacity of the state to actually really control its warfighters. So you are breeding trouble on a number of fronts. So it does not make war fighting more effective. It threatens the internal nature. It's so one of the other things which he's done, which I think we are yet to see the long-term consequences of, is in April reworked the training schemes. So issues around mental resilience have been removed. And so one of the things is if you're training people to be lethal, you want them to be mentally well. We've seen them remove that it is no longer mandatory for commanders to require personnel to undertake training in the law of armed conflict and ethics. You know, these are actually quite important things, particularly when we're trying to take that moral high ground when it comes to why are we actually engaging in war. So the ushered bill and why we go to war, and also what we do in war, let alone what we do after war. Also the education side with regards to the banning of 400 books that have reference to diversity but leave in Mein Kampf on the shelves of the Naval Academy. So there's a nostalgia here for a type of war related to the past. I think it's very much tied up with that traditional concept of what things should look like in a society, but that is actually going to really undermine the United States quite significantly.
When you sum up all of these moves, it makes you begin to wonder where Hegseth is coming from. He's perhaps the least experienced defense secretary ever in the US. He's better known as a television post. Do you think he's driven by, or he's coming from that place of inexperience, or is there something deeper? Perhaps he just wants women off the battlefield.
Well, he's definitely said he wants women off the battlefield, and for a long time there was an argument that women would threaten unit cohesion, that they weren't as competent physically. The idea that they couldn't drag a man that's heavier than them from the battlefield. But it's really interesting looking at those arguments because, of course, typically it's not one person dragging someone from a battlefield. It's normally two. Or what if a weaker man can't drag the stronger, the heavier man? It's very much to do, I think, about the place of men in society. So we know that to be a combat soldier is the apex of masculinity, and that we value that in society. We give reverence to that. It's very much tied up with the concept of being a citizen, like to serve your country. Is Māori here in New Zealand, for example, there was a big debate, both during World War I and World War II, in and around whether or not Māori should fight for the New Zealand government to effectively for Mother England. And it was very strongly asserted by Sir Apana Ngata and others that this is the price of citizenship. So to serve is seen as being a super citizen of sorts. Your status is cemented as someone of value and of equal value. And I know that sounds, I've had people kind of, joke at that and say, well, great, the kind of ability to serve and die, like everybody wants that for themselves. But it's really symbolic in a society as to what we value, and we value military service. So not enabling women to be in that kind of keeps them at that second-class citizen level. There are reasons to want and not want militaries, but whilst they're here and whilst states exist, they have that status in our society. And it's also tied up. We know that militaries are also tied up with different concepts around, who gets to be a citizen, not just women, but minorities. As I said, here in New Zealand, really important for Māori to try and cement their status as equals by, if you both die together on the battlefield, then you are equal to your Pākehā brothers. Yeah.
If you were sat talking not with me, but with Pete Hegseth or the head of another major military, what would be the number one piece of advice you'd give them?
Well, normally the way to convince people about things like women, peace and security and the importance of engaging with minorities and supporting affirmative action is around operational effectiveness. Because that's the sell that you can give to military personnel, is to simply make them more effective on the battlefield. But the status of military institutions and such, that I also want to say, is just at the moment, it's not just about the intrinsic aspect. It's not just about the instrumental aspect of serving. It's about the intrinsic nature of serving. It's tied up with rights, and it's tied up with the need to have our institutions that are really important in society reflect that whole of society. then we get the so-called vaunted diversity of thought as problem-solving teams, but we also acknowledge that everybody in our society belongs in that society. And I think that's why particularly things about the attacks on women and transgender personnel as well as minorities are so problematic. Yeah.
And at its heart, it damages the readiness of militaries to fight?
100%. Absolutely. It's tied up with the cohesion of a society, right? As well. Like, we know that in war, what you want is a cohesive society, is a capable fighting force at the front, a cohesive society behind, running a war economy, but everybody believing in the cause. And if you don't see yourself reflected in that cause, how are you going to generate, particularly over any longer period of time, an effective and motivated force? We know that morale is so important. It's so significant to the success of military activities. Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Sure. Professor Bethan Greener, thank you so much for your time today.